welcome to Local Heroes, the series in which I seek out those amazing men and women who, by their brilliance, ingenuity and practicality, left a mark on the world. This week, all my heroes come from Scotland, and I'm starting in Edinburgh. My heroes have invented all sorts of things, from aeroplanes to mousetraps, but none more explosive than this.
2, 1,
Yes, well, that was the 1 o'clock gun at Edinburgh Castle, and the man who invented it was Charles Piazzi Smythe. Charles Smythe was born in Naples in 1819 and given the middle name Piazzi after an astronomer friend of his dad's. Charles became assistant astronomer at the Cape of Good Hope and came to Edinburgh in 1846.
He didn't invent the 1 o'clock gun just for the tourists. He was appalled when he first came to Edinburgh in 1846 that nobody knew what the time was. And that was really serious for the sailors who came and docked at Leith behind me, because they obviously needed to know the time for the tides and so on. And what they had to do was to get their watches or clocks and bring them up from the docks all the way up onto this hill. I bet they wish they'd had mountain bikes, because the only decent clock in Edinburgh was right here, where he worked as Astronomer Royal for Scotland in the Coulton Hill Observatory.
Piazzi set out to devise a way of saving the sailors a trip up the hill. One of his jobs as Astronomer Royal was to keep time for Edinburgh and indeed for Scotland, and he did that with this telescope. This is a transit telescope, and if you have a look at it, you'll find that it'll move up and down like this. That's going south and that's north, but it doesn't go sideways at all. It's absolutely locked onto the meridian. And what he used to do, Piazzi Smythe, was to sit here in this very chair, this is his chair, and look through this scope and simply watch when particular stars went past the crosshairs in the eyepiece here. Betelgeuse, for example, which is the bright left shoulder of Orion. And he might expect it at, say, 2:35 in the morning. So he'd sit here from 2:30, no sign of it, 2:31, 2:32. Ah, it's coming up, crossing. It's 2:34, so it's a minute early, or rather the clock is running a minute slow. So he moved the clock on. And that way he kept the clock absolutely perfect on sidereal time, and indeed translated that to Greenwich Mean Time. And that was the best time in Edinburgh. On the Nelson Monument, next to the observatory, he rigged up a time ball, which dropped at 1 o'clock, and was connected by the longest bit of wire in the world directly to the gun on the castle battlements. For the first firing, hundreds of VIPs were gathered to toast the great event. 1 o'clock came, and nothing happened. There was a fault in the circuit, and they had to try again the next day. The trouble was that Edinburgh was absolutely full of factories, and they belched out smoke, and the city was known as Old Reekie, and that ruined the view. He could see bright things like Betelgeuse, but anything a bit fainter was really hard to observe. And he thought it would be much better if they didn't have observatories in the middle of cities like this, but on remote mountain tops. And so in 1856, he borrowed a boat and set off with a tremendous expedition to Tenerife. From his mountaintop observatory, he saw stars and colours in the spectrum of the sun which had never been seen before. Piazzi was the first, but today no one would build a serious observatory anywhere else but on a mountain. This site, high above the clouds in the Canary Islands, is now home to the Isaac Newton telescope.
My next hero was born in 1728 in Bordeaux, where his dad was in the wine trade. He won respect from everyone for being a true philosopher of science, kind and refined, thoughtful and meticulous. He laid the foundations for the whole of modern chemistry, and he worked out why it is that ice takes so long to melt in your whiskey. His name was Joseph Black.
Before Black came along, people were puzzled about what happened to heat when ice melted or when water boiled and condensed. The heat seemed to disappear and then reappear later. This was especially interesting to Black's friends in the whisky business. This is the still house where they actually make the whisky. Down here, there's a huge boiler fired by oil, and it turns water into steam, and the steam goes up over there through those silver pipes and down and into the bottom of this thing and that one, these great orange things, which are the stills. And what happens is the steam goes round and round in the bottom and turns the fresh wash into vapour, and the vapour goes up through this funny shaped chimney and down the back into the next building, where it's condensed again to make the whisky. And it takes an enormous amount of energy at this end to heat it up, and then they have to extract an enormous amount of heat at the other end, and the way they do that is with river water. All distilleries are always built on the banks of rivers, and here they're warming up this little local river by 15 degrees. It was about 1756 when Joseph Black got interested in the problems of heat, and in particular he began to wonder about why ice cubes take so long to melt. Now, I've got a couple of ice cubes here in this glass, and I've stuck a thermometer in them, and you can see that it reads about 0.2 of a degree. It should be exactly 0, but the water probably isn't quite pure and the probe is sticking out a bit, but it's very close to 0. And over here I've got some whiskey, and that's at 19 degrees, okay, 19.3 or something. We just make sure it is whiskey. I wouldn't want to use anything else. Yes, that is whiskey. Now I'll just put a little bit into my ice here. And I hate doing this, but occasionally one has to suffer in the interest of science. You know, I'd much rather have my whiskey straight. And then we'll see what the temperature of that whiskey is now. It's about 17.7, 17.6, so it's steadily dropping. But look at this. The temperature of the ice isn't changing. It's 0.3 of a degree. Now that's very odd. You expect when you put something warm into something cold that the hot thing will cool down, but that the cold thing will warm up. And that doesn't happen. So there's something very peculiar happening right here. And Black pondered this, and he thought, well, if the whiskey is getting colder, then heat's got to be going out of it. And it has to be going into the ice. There's nowhere else for it to go. But the ice isn't warming up. And it must actually take up heat, just melting the ice, turning it into water before you begin to raise its temperature. And because you can't see where that heat's going, it's hidden. He called it latent heat. And he realized the same thing must apply when you're trying to boil water too. You put a lot of heat in to get it up to boiling point, and then you need a whole lot more heat to turn it into steam. And that's why latent heat is so important to whisky makers. One of their greatest costs is the fuel they burn to overcome the latent heat of raw liquor and turn it into vapour. Then they have to take the heat out again to condense it into whisky. Here in the tun room I've got a balance set up, and on this side there's some weights, and here there's a glass of water and one of those tablets that you might possibly want to take in the morning if you'd had too much whiskey the night before. You know, you drop it in water and it fizzes. Now, when they're together on the balance like that, you can see, if I unlock it, that it's just nicely balanced. You can see the pointer is just in the middle of the scale here. So now I'm going to drop this into the water and see what happens to the balance. 1, 2, 3, in. Joseph Black was the first to do this, and he found it really exciting. Indeed, he was amazed to see that the glass lost weight. He realized the reactants were losing not air, but some new gas he could weigh. He called it fixed air because it had been fixed in the solid. He showed that the same gas turned up in toasting limestone, making beer and breathing out. We call it carbon dioxide. So not only was Black the first to identify CO2, he began quantitative chemistry. Joseph Black died on the 6th of December 1799 while he was having his supper. Just a piece of bread and a few prunes and a bowl containing a measured quantity of milk diluted with water. He set his bowl down upon his knees and died without spilling a drop. It was almost as though he'd deliberately done an experiment to find out whether he could die as peacefully and precisely as he had lived. My next hero was an enthusiastic croquet player who lived here at Melrose in the Borders for more than 30 years, right next to Melrose Abbey. He worked all his life with polarised light, and it's polarised light that makes my Polaroid specs go dark and light. His name was David Brewster. Brewster's work on polarised light was so important that he had an angle, the Brewster angle, named after him. But much more interesting is what happened when he looked in the mirror. In 1813, he was investigating what happened when he bounced light off two mirrors, and suddenly, before his very eyes, he found beautiful patterns developing. He realised that the number of images he got depended on the angle between the mirrors, and that if he wanted a whole number of images, he had to have a simple factor of 360 degrees, like 30 or 60 or 90. In fact, he'd invented the kaleidoscope. He wrote a long and very boring book about it, in which he included a chapter on the fine and useful arts, and claimed that the kaleidoscope would be brilliant for designing carpets. My next hero was born in 1550. He was the 8th Laird of Merchiston. His name was John Napier, and he lived right here. Well, actually, right there. Marvellous Merchiston, as he was called, was born in Merchiston Castle, which ironically is now in the middle of a university, even though Napier himself never completed a degree, apparently because of his bad temper.
John Napier did all sorts of things, but his favourite hobby was astronomy. He used to go up onto the battlements and gaze at the stars. And here outside Edinburgh, the air was lovely and clear. But the problem was the sums he had to do for his astronomy. Now, he hated doing sums and spent a lot of time working out ways to get around them. One of the things he invented was logarithms. And if you're as old as I am, you may remember these things. Log tables, absolute torture at school. He also invented a pocket calculator.
Lots of people have trouble with arithmetic. I don't know about you, but I find that adding up's okay, taking away is more difficult, multiplying's quite hard, and dividing can be a real pain. It was exactly the same in the 16th century, and what Napier set out to do was to make a machine, or at least a set of instruments, that would allow people to multiply simply by adding up. And here they are. This is a set of Napier's rods, or Napier's bones, as they were called, because they were always made of ivory. They're simply a set of rods with numbers on them, and they allowed you to multiply just by adding up. You could buy 10 or 20 or 30, according to how much money you wanted to spend. Let me show you one example. Now, suppose I want to multiply 8 by 43. Here's the column with the red spot, which is what I'm going to multiply by, and that's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And for 43, I've got a 4 column and a 3 column. And the 4 column is simply the 4 times table. If you look, it goes 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, and so on. And the 3 column is simply the 3 times table. It goes 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, and like that. And the result is I can multiply simply by adding up. Have a look at this. 8 times 43, read across from the 8. The answer is 300, and 2 and 2 on that diagonal line is 44. 344. And now I'll just adjust them slightly. And suppose I want to multiply by 9. Then I look across the bottom, and the answer is 300. And 6 and 2 is 8. 387. I'm not a mathematical genius. I'm not multiplying. I'm simply adding up. Napier himself said, "Some are accustomed to make arithmetic frightening by their very love of the subject." This instrument was designed to get away from all that, and it's exactly what happened. This was the most important calculating tool for more than 150 years. John Napier's famous for his 2 important inventions that allow us to multiply by just adding up. They were Napier's bones and logarithms. Unfortunately, they've both gone out of use now because we've got calculators and computers, but he did make one other invention which has proved to have lasting value, and it's this: the decimal point. I'm heading into deepest Perthshire, past the place where the kings of Scotland were crowned, on the stone of Scone. My next hero was an adventurous gardener who was born in 1798 right here in the village of Scone. Well, it used to be a village, but a few years later the 3rd Earl of Mansfield decided he didn't want a village on his doorstep and moved the whole thing 3 miles down the road, leaving only the village cross. So my hero was actually the last baby born in Old Scone. His name was David Douglas. When he was in his 20s, he went off to North America and discovered the Californian sheep and the Californian vulture. He also discovered more than 200 new species of plants and trees. And one of the seeds he sent back to his dad, who was stonemason in the village, grew up into this tree. It's a Douglas fir, named after him. And it's not actually a fir at all, it's somewhere between a fir and a spruce. And this is the first one ever to have grown in Europe. Unfortunately, in 1834 he went to Hawaii, where on the 12th of July he fell into a pit and was trampled to death by a wild bull. Whenever I find myself by the banks of the Silvery Tay, I think about the social problem that was solved by my next hero right here in 1932. His name was Gilbert Malloch. Now, picture the scene. He's out for a walk by the river with his walking stick. There's a walking stick, and suddenly he's overcome with a feeling he has to do some fishing. So he can replace the ferrule on the end of his walking stick with a salmon gaff like this. And then, should any salmon come within range, let's just see, yes, that ought to do, he can gaff it in one easy movement like this. And you can, oh, well, I must have missed. But anyway, if there had been a salmon there, I would undoubtedly have caught it. And suppose he was feeling less vicious towards the salmon, he could replace it with a landing net like this. The same implement, you notice. Isn't it wonderful how modern technology can be brought to bear on these social problems? And that screws up like that. And of course, like the whole of this apparatus, it is fully extendable to 6 feet. And then, of course, still with a walking stick handle on the end, he can then extend it way out into the Silvery Tay and land an enormous salmon. Look at that. Isn't that extraordinary? And then he might wish to preserve for posterity either the salmon or, of course, the Silvery Tay. So what does he have to do then? Well, first of all, take the landing net off the end. Then he's going to support his photographic apparatus on here. So he'll need a steadying bipod or biped, no bipod, I guess. And that goes on here like this. And with a flick of the wrist, it's fastened. The end goes on the ground. And then we have a rock-steady support. On the top of the support goes this very neat quick-release mechanism, which simply screws into the same socket as the landing net and so on. And then the photographic apparatus slides with one easy movement onto the quick-release, and we're ready to take our photograph. Wind on, rock-steady support. The Silvery Tay is captured in an instant. But even Mr. Malloch, the brilliant, inventive Mr. Malloch, didn't think of this use for his sporting stick. It goes under there and onto the ground, and it's a perfect bicycle stand. Ground sheet, fly sheet, tent, cattle. Some of my heroes are sort of irrepressibly heroic, you know, against the advice of all their family and friends. They sail off around the world or they rescue thousands of lives. But this next chap was rather different. If he hadn't been begged to by the Royal Society, he would never have left the comfort of London for the savage outback of Perthshire. His name was Neville Maskelyne. When Isaac Newton wrote his brilliant book Principia in 1687, he said that if you hung a plumb bob like this on the end of a bit of string on level ground, it would hang absolutely straight down towards the centre of the earth. But if you hung it near a mountain, and imagine that I'm a mountain, then it wouldn't hang straight down, it would hang a bit in towards the mountain, because it would be attracted not only by the earth, but also by the mountain. This idea of his came to be called the attraction of mountains. Most people thought it was a bit of a nuisance because it meant that if you were in mountainous country, you couldn't get a true vertical. But in 1772, Neville Maskelyne had the brilliant idea that he could use the attraction of mountains, first to check Isaac Newton's theory about the law of gravitation, and second to weigh the world, or more accurately, to measure the mass of the Earth. He suggested an experiment to the Royal Society, who set about choosing a suitable mountain. Charles Mason, who had just returned from surveying the Mason-Dixon line between Maryland and Pennsylvania, was sent off at ½ guinea a day plus expenses. When he found the right mountain, the Royal Society asked Mason himself to conduct the experiment. But even though they offered to double his pay, Mason refused.
The Royal Society went back to Maskelyne and asked whether he'd do it. And he said, "Oh, I couldn't possibly, I'm much too busy, and besides I'd have to ask the King for permission to leave my duties." But unfortunately the King said, "Go ahead." So he did. He set off from London and he struggled up the North Sea and then to Perth Harbour. He got all his stuff out of the ship onto horses, 45 miles up into the hills, and on the 30th of June he arrived here at this mountain which the lowlanders called Maidenpap, but the locals call Schiehallion.
The Astronomer Royal had to haul a lot of gear up the mountain. He had a 17-foot-high parallelepiped tent of painted canvas that he'd found in the basement of the Royal Society. This was for the Zenith Sector telescope. He also had 2 barometers, 2 theodolites, and a brass standard 5 foot long, accurate to 1/1000th of an inch. For a man used to living in style at Greenwich, his lifestyle was Spartan. He lived alone, with 1 man to cook and clean for him. The whole expedition cost the Royal Society £597 and 16 shillings.
Maskelyne set up 2 observation posts. First on the south side of the mountain, the other side, and then after he'd observed for a bit there, he came round here to the north side. And it actually took 11 men a whole week to move all the clubber all the way round. And on the north side he set up camp, well, it may have been right here. And what he did was essentially 2 things. First of all, he physically measured the distance between the 2 observation posts. That is, he sent out a team of surveyors who tramped all the way around the mountain with chains and theodolites, and it took them 4 months. And they measured how far this one was north of the other one. And then he carried out the same measurement, but using the stars to work out the latitude of each of the posts. And this was the instrument he used. Now, it may look just like a couple of bits of wood bolted together, but in fact, this is my zenith sector. And one bit goes in the ground like that, that's this bit, and this is hinged, you see, so it swings this way and that, and attached to it is a telescope, and also attached to it is this, which is a bit of string with a plumb bob on the end, which is going to hang straight down. And what he did was to lie here. I'm not only following in his footsteps, I'm actually lying in his dent here. Night after night when it was clear, and he would wait for stars he recognised, Capella and so on, until they were in a direct north-south line, and then he would observe them like this. And when he'd observed one, he noted the angle between the line to the star up here and the line of the vertical down this yellow string, because that's hanging straight down. And that gave him his latitude. Now, of course, there was a slight problem, because this isn't hanging straight down the plumb bob, it's actually pulled in a bit towards the mountain because it's attracted by the mountain. And that meant that there was a discrepancy in where he measured and where he actually was. The surveyors measured a distance between the 2 posts of exactly 1 mile and 3 yards. He calculated a distance between the 2 posts of 1 mile, 480 yards. So, according to his calculations, they were 477 yards further apart than they really were. And that was wonderful. It may not sound very much, but it proved that the plumb bob really had felt the attraction of the mountain, and Isaac Newton had been absolutely right. Maskelyne came up here to Schiehallion on the 30th of June, but the weather was so bad that it was actually 3 weeks before he could make a single observation. But then he really set to it. He made 337 observations of 43 different stars. He was here for 4 months on this mountain. Can you imagine the chap who was so reluctant he didn't want to leave London? At the end of it all, he held a party, not only to celebrate this tremendous result, but also to thank both the surveyors who'd been tramping round all this time and all the locals who'd been bringing him food and so on. And so he brought up a keg of whiskey from Perth and he held the party in his bothy. And it must have been quite a party, because the bothy caught fire and there was a local fiddler and his violin was burnt to death. Maskelyne had to send him another one from London.
Working out exactly what Maskelyne's result meant was actually very tedious. There were some long, boring calculations to do, and so they hired a mathematician to do it. He was a former miner, and he had a brilliant idea while he was doing the sums, so he's become a hero as well. His name was Charles Hutton. What Hutton wanted to do was to calculate how much the bob should have been pulled in by the mountain, and to do that he imagined that the mountain was built of a whole lot of separate columns of rock, like pencils, all of different heights, and he worked out the attraction of the plumb bob by each one of these columns, and in order to do that, of course, he needed to know how high they all were. Now, Maskelyne surveyors had given him a sort of map, a bit like this, with a whole mass of dots on it, and these are all the points whose heights they'd measured. But unfortunately, there weren't nearly enough dots for all the columns he wanted to use. And so he was much vexed by this, and he worried for quite a long time about how he could possibly work out the height of each of these columns of rock. And then he had a really brilliant idea. With a pencil, a very faint pencil, he said, he joined up on the map all the dots with the same height. So, for example, let me start with these 4 green ones here, which are all the points with a height above sea level of 1,050 metres. And then he went on to join the next lot up, which are the points which are 1,000 metres above sea level. The result of this was very remarkable, because just drawing these lines gives you an extraordinary feeling for the shape of the mountain. Just have a look at this. You can see at once that this is the central peak here, this is the highest bit, and then you can see that it's much longer from east to west this way than it is from north to south that way. And if you just look at this here, you can see that along here there's a ridge, all right? It's obviously higher all the way along there. And if you look there is the ridge on the mountain. It gives you a direct indication of the shape of the mountain. These lines are now called contour lines, and no one who draws a map today would ever do anything except use them. Having invented contour lines, Hutton could at last do his sums. He found the Earth was much denser than expected and suggested it might have a metal core. He then calculated the actual mass of the Earth at 5,000 million tons, which then let him work out the mass of the Sun, the Moon, and all the planets. So incredibly, Maskelyne and Hutton were able to calculate the masses of everything in the solar system from this single heroic experiment performed right here on Schiehallion in 1774. I'm sorry, that's all the heroes we have time for this week. See you next time!